Okay, well, thanks again for having me. I appreciate the invitation to come and speak. I am going to talk about the research program that I've been developing over the past about a year now in collaboration with Encana primarily, as I hold the Encana chair, and also other stakeholders in the government and academia in Alberta. And we've identified, you can see in the title here, we've identified two major projects out of really a broad range of projects we could have researched. One is on the water sources. We just heard an excellent talk about that, and I'd be very, very interested in talking to those guys about what sort of data they have. And then secondly, about the flowback chemistry, in particular characterizing it in more detail, and also the potential toxicity or hazards that maybe haven't been looked at in flowback and produced waters. So I don't need to spend much time on this. I think this has been very well covered. My numbers are a little bit out of date here, but again, we know hydraulic fracturing is fairly widespread in Alberta. We have something like 8,900 wells, I guess, now that are unconventional wells, but this is rapidly growing. It's a water-intensive process, and so the questions that we're considering are essentially here: what are the sources of water? What are alternative sources of water in Alberta to surface water or freshwater sources? What are the dissolved species in flowback or produced water that pose, in particular, pose hazards to aquatic ecosystems? Metals have been looked at in great depth, and I don't think in many cases correctly, by the way. But perhaps the more novel part that we're doing here in Alberta is looking at the organic side of things, and I'll get into that as I move through the talk. And then finally, all of these things sort of hopefully will inform improved disposal and reuse practices in the province. In terms of numbers, these are a bit out of date. I guess it's 2009, but there's something like 10 billion cubic meters of water that's allocated in Alberta. And just to reiterate, the amount used by the oil and gas industry is fairly modest if you compare it to, for example, irrigation or municipal uses. But of that fraction, you can see here that actually in all categories, the majority of the water allocation is as surface water. So groundwater is a fairly modest component even of the oil and gas use. And we're interested in, in terms of saline or near fresh water, we're interested in exploiting more of that resource so that, we're mitigating the use of fresh surface waters. So with that in mind, if we're going to do that, AER has this really nice tool online, but it defines sort of the definition of the basic groundwater protection. So in fact, it protects waters that have a TDS, or total dissolved solids, that's less than 4,000 ppm. And so if it's greater than 4,000 ppm, then it's essentially exempt from the Water Act. The drinking water guideline for Canada is less than 500 milligrams per liter, ideally. So you have this window between about 500 and 4,000 that I've been calling sort of near fresh water, and I think that's not a term that I've originated, but one that I've sort of been using. And so that's water that indeed is protected by the Water Act, so it's sort of considered legally as fresh water. But in fact, it's not useful in many cases for drinking or even for agricultural purposes. And so you can go into this map tool, it's quite helpful. You can click on any township and range and sort of get the basic groundwater protection for anywhere in the province. Now, superimposed on that, of course, is the water short areas in Alberta. So just to remind you, I think many people have seen this, but the northern part of the province essentially is not water short. Then you enter in an area between Edmonton and Calgary, roughly a band that goes east to west that's potentially water short in the sort of orange color there. And then in red, we know that the southern part of the province is water short. So the majority of the water use for oil and gas, I mean, this is from a CAP report that's now a few years old, but you can see the vast majority is out of the water short and the potentially water short regions. However, the use, with the onset of hydraulic fracturing after this report, basically, right, the majority of it's happened after 2008. There's a question about, I think, how intense is the water use and hydraulic fracturing in these water short areas, even in the potentially water short areas. And that's, Joel Gieman gave a talk this morning, but that's one of the things that we're assessing in this CWN Canadian Water Network project. So this is just, take a quick look at what's going on. I pulled up a map on Frac Focus a couple months ago. I gave a similar talk at the University of Calgary a couple months ago. And of course, everyone here is aware of Frac Focus. It's been mandatory in BC since the beginning of 2012 and in Alberta since the beginning of 2013. And what you can see if you look at the activity, of course, it's all kind of up the Front Range from Calgary up to the BC border. And if I superimpose on this activity, the line that separates the potentially water short areas from the not water short areas, which is that line, you can see that indeed there is a lot of activity that's below that line. Now, for example, the activity west of Calgary, or east of Calgary rather, those blue circles, that's coal bed methane, so that's not a very water intensive process, of course. But if you look particularly up where the Duvernay crosses into the potentially water short regions, you do have a lot of high volume wells that are located in at least potentially water short areas. So with that sort of framing, the major goals of my project, again, to repeat them, were to look at using either near fresh, and that would be sort of the Paskapoo water that was just discussed, or even saline aquifers for hydraulic fracturing to increase that use versus fresh water. And then these other 2 points that feed into the second part of the project, which is looking at first a full characterization of the organics for the first time, as full as we can be, and also the metals in flowback waters. And the idea is to really isolate the chemistry across as a function of time, or volume if you like, as the flowback and then produced waters come out, and also geographically, so spatially. And this then would feed in, these two things would sort of feed into a framework then to predict the flowback chemistry and say something about where do waters have to be recycled, where can they be reused, where should they just be deep well injected, for example. So when I came to this position, it was already funded by Encana, which was quite nice, and it had an endowment not only for the research but also for my salary, which is good. But I thought, if we go about this project directly as a directly funded research project, which we could have, it sort of lacks a little bit of impact, and that's been brought up, I think, by many people in here today. So I went about getting additional support, first from the Faculty of Science at the University of Alberta, so they put up some funding for this project. The Alberta Geological Survey is a partner. They just signed a letter of intent a few weeks ago. And we're pursuing funding at the, I should say we also have CFI, so Canada Foundation for Innovation, so that's at the national level. And we're also pursuing funding from NSERC and also from Alberta Innovates to sort of support this project. So getting into the first project then, it's looking at the regional to local impacts of withdrawing saline or near fresh water. In this case, it's near fresh water on the shallow water bodies and shallow aquifers. So recall that the area of interest, I should first say, I don't have a pointer here, but the areas of interest to Encana and the ones that we're studying are first Willesden Green, so you can see it's in the southern part of the Duvernay formation, and potentially the Kaybob, which is another area of activity. So the idea then is to look at, in great detail, at perhaps the local or sub-basinal scale, the geology, including the overburden, which hasn't been looked at, and see basically on a very sort of kilometer scale, if we design a groundwater model, run pumping scenarios, what is going to be the impact on the base flow in streams or the level of a lake or things like that? Is there going to be a significant impact if we're drawing water out of the Paskapoo, for example? So speaking of the Paskapoo, here it is. Again, I can spend less time on this because it's been covered pretty well, but the Paskapoo, you're looking at first a cross-section in the bottom left corner that goes from west to east. So it's cutting across the Rocky Mountains, and that little wedge up there, the yellow-colored wedge, is the Cenozoic in which the Paskapoo lies. It's the top layer of the Cenozoic, which is then overlain by overburden, essentially. And so first thing to say is it's much thicker as you go up against the Rocky Mountains, and it pinches out as you go to the west. And it's really it's a major regional aquifer. I mean, we heard at the bottom, the Haynes member of the Paskapoo has regions. It's a fairly complex geology to the Paskapoo, actually, but there are fairly large sand lenses in which there's a great amount of water that could be used for this sort of activity. And then just a reminder, of course, the fracturing is happening down a couple kilometers at least down in the Devonian, which is where the Duvernay lies. So there's a big spatial separation, of course, between those. Here is the Edmonton-Calgary corridor model in the bottom right-hand side, sort of tilted it on its side. And here you can see again the yellow layer is the Paskapoo, so you can see how it's thicker up against the mountains and it pinches out as you go, out past Red Deer and that sort of thing. And our area of study then is within, well, first I boxed the blue area, and that's sort of the inset in the upper left-hand corner there. And in fact, the near field of our groundwater model, numerical simulation, is going to be that yellow box. So that lies in the very southern end of the Duvernay, of course. It's about 35 kilometers north of Rocky Mountain House, something like that. And the near field is where we'll have the greatest detail in the model. And then, of course, there'll be, outside of that, a bigger model to account for boundary conditions and groundwater flow. So zooming in then on the yellow box, there's a couple things to say here. If you look on the left, that's just a groundwater surface, rather a surface elevation map. So there's something like, I guess a couple hundred feet of, or a couple hundred meters of elevation difference here. And that's representative essentially of the overburden in this area. So that's to say that, in my opinion, and the opinion of, I would say, my colleagues, there's going to be a lot of very short-term water cycles that are gravity-driven at the surface. And under this, then under the overburden, there's then the Pascaboo, which is more of a regional aquifer, lower groundwater flow rates. The big question then is you have some surface where the overburden interacts or meets with the top of the Pascaboo formation. And the question is, what are the interactions going to be between the overburden on which the wetlands and the lakes and the streams and all that good stuff lies if you're pumping from the Haynes member, which is at the bottom of the Pascaboo formation. And that's saying it succinctly sort of the point of my model. On the right is just a map then of the region with the roads, and you can see that the two wells are the large blue diamonds, and or triangles rather, I guess. And just to say that the wells are somewhat remotely located. They're in an area that's used for recreation. There is some road access. We sort of lucked out. We're doing an assessment of what sort of data we have, and there's something like 414 water well records that will get us some of the information we need. And we're looking at, I'll get into the other sources of data, I guess, here in a bit. Here it is. So this is the full conceptual model of how we're going about this. So we're in the process, we're well into developing the stratigraphic, or if you like, conceptual model for the project. And the data that's going in that is, as I said, the water well, the public water well database, which goes back quite a while. Some of them are fairly useless, some of them are quite useful. And then the other way that we're getting stratigraphic data is through fairly recent oil and gas wells in the region. So I believe since 2007 or so, all of the wells have been gamma logged from surface. And Larry Bentley at the University of Calgary has developed a really nice method of normalizing the gamma signal to be able to get at normalize it through casing to get at the stratigraphy. So such that the gamma log is sort of a proxy for this, if you like, the sandiness or something, which is then directly correlated to the hydraulic conductivity. That's our idea. So we're combining those data to feed into the stratigraphic model. We have this partnership with AGS, so we're getting some of the regional stratigraphy from them. Once the stratigraphic model is developed, then it's going to feed, once we're happy with there's some I have to be a real geologist for a little bit and combine all this stratigraphic data into a model that's connected. But that will then be translated into a groundwater model using visual modflow, I think is going to be our choice. And again, this is where I think the partnership, if you see on the right-hand side there, AGS models, talked a couple times about the ECC model, Edmonton-Calgary Corridor. There's also another model called SARGS and some sub-basinal models. The point is that these models have data that's AGS has spent years developing, and we have an agreement where essentially we can borrow the boundary conditions, the regional boundary conditions from these models, and set our very local scale model in those boundary conditions. And it's going to save us 2 or 3 years of work, which is quite nice. There's also then, on the left-hand side, there's a field component to this project. So we're going to go out into the field and set up some, I think, fairly modest monitoring equipment to look at stream fluxes, evapotranspiration, precipitation. But really the major source is historical data. I mean, Environment Canada has data going back 60 years, so there's really no reason why that we shouldn't borrow that data, because it's averaged over a much longer time. And then, of course, ultimately the groundwater model is going to be used to predict cones of depression from whatever pumping rate we want to simulate, and then any reduction on the base flows, wetlands, things like that. So I think I've said all these things. The bottom one says, I've been asked this 3 or 4 times, is there a potential to use this groundwater model in reactive transport of organic or metal contamination or gas migration? And my answer to that is groundwater models inherently have a lot of error already in them. Or uncertainty, I guess, is a better word. And if you're going to superimpose reactive transport onto uncertainty, then, maybe. I'd like to try it, but, you have to see sort of what the uncertainties are inherently in the groundwater model itself. Then the second study, I'll be a little more brief with this one. It's the bigger project, but I'll be briefer. It's looking at the flowback and produced water chemistry. So our idea is to identify components of risk to aquatic ecosystems, define where those might occur in time or volume as flowback and produced waters are produced, and then increase water use efficiency. So by saying, okay, between this day and this day, those are waters of concern, something like that. We're looking specifically, I'll say it here, we're looking at reactions that form in the subsurface. That's one of our major concerns. And to that, sort of to that end, what we're purchasing as part of this program is a laboratory reactor that can simulate the temperatures and pressures of hydraulic fracturing. And we intend to, we're going to find things in flowback, presumably, but what we can do is then try to simulate those conditions in a simplified reaction in a reactor. So that's sort of one way of trying to get a mechanistic component into this that just doesn't exist now. And yes, and I've said these things, time and volume produced, and then across the geology and geochemistry of a play is our sort of our variables. And I guess this just builds on what I said, but I'll say, there's the potential for storage in synthetically lined ponds. We heard some discussion about Directive 55. Really nice talk about that earlier. One thing that there's not is norm testing requirements in Alberta, and I'm an expert in uranium contamination actually, so I'm very interested in looking at what sort of actinides are present and things like that in the flowback or produced waters. And all that being said, I realize I certainly don't have the whole expertise for all of this. I'm an aqueous and environmental geochemist first, and I have some experience in groundwater modeling. So I'm sort of taking care of that aspect of the project. Dr. Greg Goss, you've heard his name a couple times, but he's the former executive director of our water initiative at the University of Alberta, and he's really I would say a world-class aquatic toxicologist, so he'll be looking at the toxicity of these flowback samples that we collect from the field. And then Dr. Jonathan Martin is the organic chemist, so he is a specialist in identifying, it's very non-trivial to define the molecular structure of an organic contaminant in water, and he's actually one of the sort of premier experts in Canada on these sorts of methods. Just to reiterate, last couple slides here. First, the impact to fracturing practices in Alberta. As I said, I spent some time getting a buy-in from federal, provincial, industrial, and academic entities. So I hope this is something that it was touched on in the morning, but again, there's this lack. If it would have come out as just a directly funded collaboration between Encana and myself, I think it would be a little, perhaps less impact. Now we have federal, provincial, industrial, and academic buy-ins right now, and pursuing some more of those, so I hope the impact will come from a broader a set of people. Ultimately, we're going to hopefully generate tools to minimize water use, which is good for everybody, and that also translates to cost then. Maximize reuse, again, in those areas of the potentially water-short regions, perhaps around Willesden Green is one good example. And then aid in permitting decisions, hopefully for AER and AGS. That was sort of the buy-in in them joining this project. They were interested in seeing this sub-basinal scale sort of modeling going on. And I'll throw out the term social license to operate out there. I mean, that means different things to everybody, but hopefully it will help. It's something I think that perhaps industry can point to and say, look, we don't need to do this, but this is an extra thing that we're also doing in addition to our requirements that we have to fulfill. And then broader impact, there's just general interest in the Pascapoo hydrostratigraphy. It's been studied quite a bit, but it's very complicated, so there's just a lack of knowledge about the hydrostratigraphy, and that's of interest to AGS and to me as a scientist. Outreach to community, part of our project, our agreement and our funding agreement is to have at least 2 seminars on campus at the University of Alberta where we would invite everybody, I mean all the people in here for sure, but anybody who wanted to come and attend, and the community for sure, to come and interact with scientists, the regulator, the government, and the academics, and have a conversation about this. We would present our research results and present the opportunity for others to do the same. And in terms of training people, this is an emerging issue, and we're going to train something like 50, and I think it's more like 20 people now in our program, including 10 undergraduates, 2 per year. So we'll be cranking out some people at the University of Alberta that could step into roles looking at, the environmental impacts of flowback and produced waters, or in groundwater modeling. I think that's also of value.